The image arrived in Dr. Isolde Vance's life like a shard of blackened glass, a brittle, silver gelatin print tucked into an overlooked archive box labeled simply, NYC Slums, 1900 to 1920. A historian of social upheaval, Isolde was drawn to the photograph's stark composition. It was titled, enigmatically, Gothman List, Alley Children, 1907. The perspective was claustrophobic: towering brick tenements, the perpetual gloom of the alley, and the haphazard cluster of children dominating the cobbled foreground. Isolde first focused on the context, the desperate poverty captured by the unknown lens. But the more she stared, the more the context faded, replaced by a deep, visceral unease about the subjects themselves. There was a stillness here that transcended the lengthy exposure time required by early cameras. The children weren't simply posed, they seemed arrested, frozen in an internal vacuum. The boy pulling the cart, the little girl in the cotton smock, and the tiny figure hunched near the curb. None of them displayed the characteristic blur or restless energy of youth. Their eyes, dark pools in the sepia haze, held a uniformity of expression that chilled Isolde to the bone, a profound, aged indifference. They weren't smiling, they weren't frowning, they weren't even gazing curiously at the photographer. They were simply present, their gazes fixed on a point beyond the lens, beyond the world. This was not the look of tired children. It was the look of children who had forgotten what it was to feel. It was this unnerving, uncanny stillness, the lack of life in the midst of a living city, that convinced Isolde that this was more than a record of poverty. It was a document of loss, or perhaps, a terrible, untold secret. Gothman Alley was a place the sun merely grazed, never illuminated. Cradled between two towering rows of six-story brick tenements, the air was perpetually dense, a suffocating mixture of coal smoke, unwashed laundry, and the faint, sickly sweet decay of refuse. To enter Gothman was to step into a vertical canyon where the sky was reduced to a pale, gray strip. It didn't just feel like a dead end, it felt like a tomb, sealed by gravity and grime. In 1907, the very atmosphere in the alley had acquired a reputation for being wrong. Not merely oppressive, but silent. The cobblestones, usually echoing with the boisterous, chaotic life of immigrant families, shouted greetings, arguing neighbors, the inevitable shrieks of children, were becoming strangely muted. The adults walked with their heads bowed, their conversations hushed to conspiratorial murmurs, as if speaking too loudly might invite scrutiny from the indifferent brick walls. What struck Isolde most, as she cross-referenced architectural drawings with period maps, was the oppressive uniformity of the space. Fire escapes crisscrossed the light shaft, casting a network of sharp, metallic shadows, and every window was a narrow, opaque rectangle. The residents were not simply living in the city, they were being walled in by it. But the true source of unease was the lack of juvenile noise. Children's laughter is the lifeblood of a city street, yet here, in Gothman Alley, the primary source of sound was the clatter of the refuse carts and the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of distant industry. The very heart of the alley was slowing down, growing cold, muffled not by cotton, but by a chilling, invisible presence. The silence wasn't a pause. It was a heavy, permanent resignation that seeped from the bricks and settled into the lungs. The shift wasn't sudden, it was insidious, creeping into the routines of Gothman Alley life like the fog that often choked the riverside. It began not with a scream, but with a muffled sound that wasn't a sound at all. One autumn afternoon, little Killian, the son of a laundress in the central tenement, tripped over a loose cobblestone, spilling his meager delivery of kindling. He went down hard, scraping his knees raw. His mother, Maeve, rushed to him, bracing herself for the inevitable wail. But the sound never came. Killian's face crumpled, his mouth opened in the classic shape of distress, his eyes squeezed shut, tears welled, but the deep, resonating sound of a child's true cry was absent. All that escaped was a small, high-pitched gasp, quickly followed by a heavy, shuddering breath. It was as if the emotional valve was open, but the acoustic chamber had been blocked. Maeve dismissed it as shock, but within weeks, other mothers reported the same frightening phenomenon. A cut finger produced a grimace, not a shriek. A stolen toy resulted in a defeated shrug, not a torrent of sobs. The children were displaying the visual language of pain and sadness, but their voices offered only weak, breathy whimpers. Fear, initially contained as private worry, soon swelled into a communal, fearful realization among the parents. Their children were not just quiet, they were losing the ability to emote audibly. The natural restorative release of a heartfelt cry was gone, leaving the pain trapped and burning behind stoic, increasingly hollow eyes. The silence of the alley was no longer passive, it had become an active, terrifying symptom. Dr. Isolde Vance spent weeks immersed in the brittle, ammonia-scented archives of the City Department of Health and the forgotten ledgers of St. Michael's Parish, the closest church to Gothman Alley. The parish records, painstakingly maintained by priests who tracked births, deaths, and illnesses in the tenement district, were her first real point of leverage. She wasn't looking for deaths, she was searching for hospitalizations and medical complaints linked to the alley's precise addresses, specifically, the years 1905 to 1908. The initial entries were vague: fever, debility, extreme malnourishment. But the deeper Isolde went, cross-referencing these names with the notes scrawled by exasperated or mystified medical staff at the charity wards, the clearer the pattern became. A recurring entry, clinical and cold, leapt out from the cramped, spidery handwriting of the attending physicians. It was often a secondary observation, listed after the primary diagnosis of consumption or rickets, but it was disturbingly consistent. Puerile apathy, noted. Absence of audible emotional response. In other notes, it was shortened to AAER, or simply, the mute grief. Isolde calculated that over those 3 years, 47 distinct cases were documented from the 6 buildings lining Gothman Alley, an astronomical rate for any single, specific neurological or emotional symptom in such a confined area. The notes detailed the children's vacant stares, their silent, gasping sobs, and their parents' desperate, frustrated reports. The victims were overwhelmingly between the ages of 4 and 9. This was no statistical fluke, it was a targeted, concentrated affliction that the medical establishment could name, but not explain. Isolde felt a cold knot of certainty. The photograph was not just history, it was evidence of a specific, localized tragedy. Dr. Alistair Hawthorne was a man of cold logic, a physician who believed firmly in the observable, the quantifiable, and the diagnosis printed in the most recent medical journals. When the first silent children from Gothman Alley arrived at his ward, pale, listless, and often misdiagnosed with generic nervous exhaustion, he was initially dismissive. He attributed the lack of crying to the crushing psychological effect of poverty. "Why expend the energy," he'd scoffed privately, "when the relief never comes?" But the sheer volume of cases, and the uniformity of the symptom, began to chip away at his certitude. This wasn't merely apathy, it was a specific, physiological block. He noted that when he administered painful stimuli, the children flinched, their heart rates spiked, and tears often flowed, yet the vocal apparatus remained inert. Their diaphragm and lungs seemed incapable of producing the deep, resonant expulsion of air required for a true cry. It was as though a specific, primitive reflex had been meticulously excised. Dr. Hawthorne, a realist by nature, began to feel an intellectual terror. His notes shifted from casual dismissal to meticulous observation. He ruled out known diseases, searching desperately for a common dietary or infectious cause. He found none. The children were displaying physical signs of severe emotional distress, yet they moved through it with a ghostly, mechanical restraint. Hawthorne began to suspect something far more sinister than poverty or malnourishment, a localized, environmental poison, perhaps, or a subtle, pervasive neurological assault that defied every known textbook. The rationalist was turning into a skeptic of his own science. Every road, Isolde knew, has a focal point, and for Gothman Alley, it was the building dead center in the photograph, the massive, 5-story brick structure that seemed to loom over the rest. It was distinguished by its sheer, featureless expanse of wall and its windows, which, unlike the others festooned with drying clothes or potted plants, were dark, recessed, and opaque, truly earning Isolde's description of vacant eyes. Local lore, pieced together from fragmented memories recorded in a 1930s Federal Writers Project interview, held that this building had always been wrong. Before 1905, it wasn't a residential tenement at all. It was an industrial structure, but its purpose shifted frequently and mysteriously. A tannery one year, a dye works the next, often sitting empty for long, unnerving periods. Even when it housed tenants, other residents of Gothman Alley avoided its stoop. They claimed the air around it felt thinner, and that during the silent years, the children who played closest to its entrance were the first to stop crying. Isolde tracked the building's deeds, finding a deliberately confusing chain of ownership, a series of shell corporations with names like the Apex Holding Trust and the Mercantile Sanitation Group. The constant shuffling of paper suggested not neglect, but calculated anonymity. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that no single, traceable entity could be held accountable for whatever function that hulking structure performed between 1904 and 1908. It was the geographic and legal heart of the mystery, a cold, hollow chamber meant to hide something vital from the eyes of the city. Isolde's relentless search for non-medical testimony led her away from official documents and into the haphazard domain of digitized historical newspapers. Deep within the microfiche archives of a defunct neighborhood gazette, she finally found her breakthrough, a nearly forgotten small article from May 1910, 2 years after the worst of the Gothman silence. It was an interview with an unnamed, former resident of the alley, published just as the demolition rumors began to circulate. The witness, identified only as the baker's wife, was terrified, speaking on the condition that her name and current location never be revealed. She didn't dwell on the children's silence, she focused on the central tenement. She claimed the building hadn't held textiles or chemicals, at least not in the usual sense. Instead, it was used by a secretive wealthy individual who she only referred to as the professor, to store the equipment for a horrible, failed experiment. The woman's account was fragmented, bordering on the feverish. She spoke of strange low vibrations emanating from the structure at night, of veiled deliveries, and most chillingly, of a heavy, humming apparatus that was discarded and then quickly retrieved from the alley's refuse pile one cold morning in late 1906. She was certain the children, in their scavenging, had been drawn to this object, an artifact of sorrow, long before the adults knew it was there. This single, anonymous testimony connected the unexplained medical condition directly to the building's hidden purpose, transforming the clinical affliction into a terrifying instance of accidental contamination. Isolde's focus returned to the central tenement's convoluted ownership history. The shell companies, the Apex Holding Trust, the Mercantile Sanitation Group, were deliberate decoys, but the names themselves held a subtle clue. Sanitation, mercantile, they suggested legitimate municipal or commercial functions designed to camouflage something else. The paperwork indicated these companies frequently leased the building to private research concerns or storage ventures affiliated with various wealthy patrons, none of whom were ever named directly. More unsettling than the paper trail, however, was the building's human history. Isolde consulted old city directories and census records for Gothman Alley. She discovered that prior to 1904, the central tenement was periodically used as a temporary barracks for transient workers, dock laborers, seasonal factory hands, many of whom were listed in one census and vanished from the next. There was no record of them moving, no deaths, just a sudden, complete erasure from the official count. This pattern of human disappearance suggested the building was used not just to hide an experiment's equipment, but its human subjects or necessary components. It hinted at a darker, more protracted operation than the brief storage of a single chemical apparatus. The building was designed, Isolde realized, to be a place of quiet ingress and egress, where people, or evidence, could be moved without scrutiny. The children's subsequent silence was perhaps not the first, but merely the most visible and pathetic consequence of the building's sinister, decades-long history of erasure. The lack of audible sorrow was chilling, but Isolde's most unnerving discovery came from a surviving fragment of a social workers' case file from 1908. It wasn't the children's affliction that was detailed, but their play. Normally, alley games were chaotic, inventive, and loud, a blur of tag, shouted rules, and triumphant cries. But the social workers' notes described the Gothman children's activities with words like rigid, repetitive, and unvarying. They weren't playing, they were performing rituals. The boy in the foreground of the photograph, for instance, pushing the heavy wooden cart. Witnesses recalled he would often move it in the same small, figure-8 loop on the cobblestones for an hour, his gait stiff, his expression blank. The girls would stand in fixed, solemn circles, hands linked, chanting words that sounded like a nursery rhyme but lacked any recognizable meter or tune. There was no joy in winning, no frustration in losing. They displayed a perfect affective neutrality. Their actions were impulses without passion, movement without motive. They acted, as Dr. Hawthorne had noted, with a ghostly, mechanical restraint. It was as though the very essence of imaginative, spontaneous youth had been replaced by a low-level, biological imperative to simply keep moving. The children's silence had physically blocked their cries, but their mechanical games suggested a deeper, neurological assault, one that had effectively stolen their souls and replaced them with automatons. Driven by the unsettling newspaper clipping and the cold certainty of his own observations, Dr. Alastair Hawthorne, now retired but still haunted by the Gothman cases, had dedicated his final years to one question: what poison leaves no trace? In his official reports from 1908, he had theorized a slow, environmental heavy metal exposure, but the symptoms, specifically the vocal paralysis coupled with preserved motor function, didn't quite fit the profile of lead or arsenic poisoning. Hawthorne's private research, rediscovered by Isolde Vance in a dusty trunk of his papers, detailed his final, desperate experiment. Unable to access the sealed alley after the worst of the epidemic subsided, he obtained samples of Gothman Alley soil and pulverized brick from an old colleague. He subjected them to every known analytic test, searching for trace elements that could disrupt the larynx or the vagus nerve. The results were maddeningly inconclusive. He found the expected residue of industrial pollution, but nothing that explained the mute grief. Yet, in his final barely legible entry, dated 1914, he wrote of his theory: "It is not a poison of mass, but of frequency. A vibration, absorbed through the air, perhaps, that resonates with the fine musculature of the throat. A chemical ghost." He suspected a compound so volatile, so quickly metabolized or dissipated upon exposure to the open air, that it left no physical signature in the body or the soil. The children were victims of a brief, intense, and invisible acoustic or chemical shock, one that burned out their ability to cry before vanishing into the smoke of the city. The former residents' cryptic testimony about the heavy, humming apparatus became the focus of Isolde Vance's terrifying reconstruction. Based on the timing, the silent affliction starting in late 1906, shortly after the supposed retrieval, Isolde theorized the children found the discarded object during a brief, critical window. The central tenement, in its guise as a private research concern, had been using the alley's refuse area as a temporary disposal site. The apparatus, likely a metallic cylinder or box, was heavy, cumbersome, and possibly warm, emitting that low vibration the baker's wife described. It was precisely the kind of strange, forbidden object that would lure the curious, scavenging children of Gothman Alley. Isolde imagined the scene, the boy with the cart, perhaps, leading the others. They would have congregated around it, touching the metal, fascinated by its strange hum. This exposure, Isolde concluded, was not an injection or ingestion, but a subtle, intense exposure to a concentrated, volatile element, Dr. Hawthorne's chemical ghost. This element, possibly radioactive or a sonic weapon prototype, violently but briefly interfered with the children's central nervous systems, specifically targeting the complex motor vocal function responsible for a full, natural cry. The effect was immediate and irreversible. They didn't contract a disease. They were struck by a localized, man-made curse, sealed by the very hands that should have been protecting them. By the spring of 1912, the Gothman silence had become an untenable political liability. Reports of the children's bizarre affliction, though officially categorized as mass hysteria or extreme psychological depression, had begun to leak into the city's more sensationalist papers, painting a picture of an urban rot too deep for charity. The silent children were a specter haunting the mayor's public relations efforts, a visible failure of the era's progressive ideals. The official response was swift, brutal, and utterly lacking in scientific curiosity. The city council, spurred by a highly effective, and almost certainly paid-for, campaign, declared Gothman Alley a terminal sanitation hazard. The narrow confines, the perpetual gloom, and the lack of modern sewage were cited as reasons for immediate, complete demolition. It was a perfect, socially acceptable excuse to literally bury the evidence. Isolde's discovery of the demolition order revealed the chilling lack of due process. There were no follow-up medical investigations, no attempts to trace the source of the chemical contamination, and most significantly, no provisions made for the afflicted children beyond a cursory dispersal to other, equally impoverished districts. The priority was not public health, it was public erasure. The city wasn't solving a problem, it was removing a scandal, scattering the human witnesses like chaff and guaranteeing that the truth of the failed experiment would be crushed beneath the wrecking balls. The physical demolition of Gothman Alley was swift and brutal, but the dismantling of its community was crueler and more lasting. With the buildings reduced to dust and timber in 1912, the families were given peremptory notices and minimal aid, effectively tossed into the anonymity of the sprawling metropolis. They were scattered seeds blown to the furthest, poorest edges of the city, their affliction, the children's silence, now camouflaged by a broader context of urban misery. The city's bureaucracy made no attempt to track the afflicted children. In fact, Isolde Vance suspected a covert effort was made to ensure they disappeared. The names documented by Dr. Hawthorne were swallowed by shifting addresses, hastily processed immigration papers, and the chaos of the public school system. The children of the Gothman photo, the boy with the cart, the silent figures, were no longer a concentrated problem, they became statistical ghosts. This dispersal, Isolde realized, was the perfect final act of the cover-up. The specific, localized evidence of a failed experiment was destroyed, and its human consequences were diffused. A single child who couldn't cry in a new, distant tenement was an isolated tragedy, easily dismissed as a result of trauma or inherent defect. The collective, terrifying pattern was erased, ensuring that no physician, social worker, or journalist would ever again connect the 47 silent cases back to the toxic, forgotten secrets of Gothman Alley. Dr. Isolde Vance had become a fixture in the dusty recesses of the municipal archives, a quiet woman surrounded by brittle paper and the ghosts of Gothman Alley. Her single-minded obsession with the silent children was no longer an academic pursuit, it was a personal crusade. She had painstakingly reconstructed the entire narrative, the secret laboratory, the failed apparatus, the resultant contagion, and the calculated demolition that followed. Her reconstruction pointed to a decades-old crime orchestrated by powerful, wealthy interests. The consequences of digging too deep materialized not as a threat, but as a subtle, administrative chill. One afternoon, a file Isolde had been working on, a crucial building permit from 1904 that named a key corporate trustee, was found to be misfiled and suddenly unavailable. A few days later, a stiff, formal letter arrived at her university office, bearing the letterhead of a shadowy, little-known historical review board. It was not overtly threatening, merely a recommendation to redirect her considerable talents toward less speculative, better documented areas of urban history. The language was polite, the tone professionally detached, but the message was crystalline: drop the Gothman case. Isolde recognized the hand of the powerful entities that had shielded the central tenement a century prior. They were still here, still watching, still guarding the secret of the silent children. The warning served only to intensify her resolve. The threat proved that the horror she was uncovering was not just historical, it was active and dangerous. Dr. Isolde Vance sat in her office, the letter from the Historical Review Board pushed aside. On her desk lay the original, delicate print, Gothman List, Alley Children, 1907. It was the only concrete thing left after the decades of cover-up, the final, undeniable piece of evidence. The alley was gone, Dr. Hawthorne was dead, and the children were untraceable, yet the horror remained, captured in the stillness of their antique gaze. Isolde ran a careful finger over the face of the little girl in the cotton smock. She finally understood the scope of the tragedy. The demolition had not fixed the problem, it had simply relocated the affliction. The city had succeeded in destroying the location of the chemical ghosts, but they had failed to cure the human consequences. The silent children, now scattered and grown, were still carrying the affliction within them, adults who had lost the ability to express profound grief or unbridled joy. They were citizens of a vibrant city, trapped in an internal Gothman Alley of permanent emotional muteness. Isolde knew she couldn't publish her full findings, the legal and political machinery behind the cover-up was too powerful. But she had the photograph. She secured the print in a heavy, light-proof archival box, not as a historical artifact, but as a warning. It was the portrait of a hidden crime, a reminder that the silence of the oppressed is often manufactured, and that sometimes, the most monstrous secret of all is the thing that was intentionally destroyed, leaving only a faded, unforgettable image to testify to the cruelty of the past.